Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming back and joining us second day in the afternoon. Very interesting discussions we've had so far. I know our panelists have already been introduced. Some of them have already spoken not so long ago. But I will give a very quick reminder. Of course, Richard Gendal Brown down here at the end, the CTO of R3, and the creator of, initially it was a banking consortium, and now this new software Corda, the best blockchain for business, right, Anthony? Outside of that, you do argue with a lot of people on your blogs. We heard about that. It's always fun to watch, so do check out his blog. George Ornbo, CTO at Clearmatics, and also working with a team developing utility settlement coins, something we also heard about this afternoon, which is working with central banks to tokenize money. Maya, obviously the veteran of crypto here. She's been here longer than the rest of us combined. She works as a consultant. In addition, she's held roles at Coin Sciences, at Kedit, looking at the first zero-knowledge proof for enterprise blockchain, if I'm not mistaken. And you've also were a founding member of the Israeli Blockchain Forum. So thank you very much all for joining. Today, of course, we're going to talk about enterprise blockchain, which is something that I've been interested for a while. I have a lot of questions here that I think are interesting to the audience. Want to get into some of the technical foundings of it, but also if we can kind of hit on some of the philosophical aspects of why are we doing these things? Because I think a lot of people who are more familiar maybe with the permissionless space are saying, why are banks trying to do private blockchains? This makes no sense. So if I can kind of just start and kick us off, Richard gave an idea about what an enterprise DLT was. I'd be curious, Maya and George, what do you think about his definitions, and how would you define an enterprise DLT?
Well, I guess for us, we would agree with everything that Richard said about enabling participants to transact seamlessly and increased operational efficiency. I'd maybe go a bit beyond that in the idea that we really can introduce new business models and new economic models just by having pseudo-anonymous participants on the same network. So we can start to remutualize businesses that have become very centralized. So if you think about clearinghouses, historically they were member-owned organizations. And what blockchain, I think, can offer is the ability to reintroduce those kind of member mutual models.
Can I just ask real quick, when you talk about member mutual models, how is that different for people that aren't familiar with that market?
So I guess, typically with a CCP or a clearinghouse, it's a centralized entity, and parties will transact with them, but there's a rent-seeking intermediary there. So by decentralizing that business model, those members can transact directly with each other, reducing the cost, but also potentially they can have some governance over that entity as well.
So I would actually say that I think there's more and more of an overlap between the incentive or the financial incentive systems of taking part in that network, right? And in the permissionless space, we're used to talking a lot about different token incentives, mechanism design, and such of the governance nodes and supplies. Whereas in the private blockchain space, it's more about the equity of the investors, right, in Clearmatics, the membership design for the governance of different Corda members, who has a say in the company that is building these private blockchains, but two, also in the consortia that are being built with this technology. And in some ways, I find it fascinating, the dialogue between the permissioned and the permissionless space, because they're essentially trying to get at the same models of disintermediating the way business and finance works. Whether or not it's open and censorless, that's a philosophical decision. But we cannot ignore that the majority of finance, of money, of actual capital, goes through the existing business corporate world that these guys are working very closely with.
So you're drawing a parallel between, of course, in public blockchains having things like mining or stakers, users, as well as the development teams, and you're saying that there exists a parallel inside of a permission blockchain space.
Yeah, because think about it. If a company comes out and ICOs itself, it's basically saying, hey, buy a token that you can later use in the network that I'm going to end up buying, and then I'm going to maybe need to pay for the decentralization through inflation, through tokens, or maybe just a lump sum of fiat. Whereas the business world is saying, hey, we already know that we're the guys that want to build our own network, say B3I or Solomon Coin. And the participants of this network are either nodes or or entities transacting through that network. And they don't necessarily need that token, but then again, they are paying that one company that is building that, whether or not it's R3 or if it's Clearmatics, and giving them the funds to continue developing and governing this technology. Whereas in ICOs, you also have that one singular company that ICO'd, and if at some point there's a foundation, that's an open-ended question, but currently the ICO company is the one leading the development, the decisions of that network.
So I'm not quite sure I agree with that. So I agree with the bit in the middle, but you said something at the beginning and the end that I didn't think was quite right. So you set up a division between public and private blockchains, and I'm not quite sure that's one I see, because if I look at Corda Network, I would say Corda Network is open. Anyone who can prove their identity, so there is a check, but anyone who can prove their identity can join Corda Network. This isn't proprietary or private to some membership. This is open to any company in the world. And with respect to the idea that it's somehow controlled by some group, if I look at just examples of people who are building on Corda, so just one that jumps into my mind is
Can I be a node on 6? Can I be a node on 6?
Hang on a sec. You can on Corda Network, yes. So if I go to a firm who's building on Corda in Canada to deal with royalties for oil and gas under people's houses, there's no banks involved in that. And if I look at Corda Network's governance, like I said, go to Corda.network, not controlled by R3. It's an independent foundation, not for profit. The people who sit on that board, I think there's actually a process that shows how they're selected, how they're voted, what they vote on, what they do when they disagree. They can fire R3 as the operator. It's I would argue the governance of that is more transparent than a network that's governed by a cabal of miners in some other country. So it's completely wide open.
I'll agree with that.
Yeah.
That's not the question that I think is the parallel. I think that there's also a sort of convergence that's going on, right? We're going to have all these new public chain, Definity, Cosmos, Polkadot. And a lot of these layer 2 projects are very similar in terms of the architecture to the networks that are built on the Corda network, right? If it's the B3I or 6 and so forth. And they themselves will be perhaps permissioned just as much as those implementations of Corda. However, the Corda network might be open source, but not anyone can be a validator on these on the channel or in one of these
actually
networks.
We actually document as well how you can become a validator and what the independent board, I guess independent of us, what they will need to see from you in terms of the algorithm you run and how you operate to get approved as a validator. And because of the way Corda works, if you want to configure a group of nodes to trust a validator of their choice, you can do that. Corda supports multiple validators on the same network. So, okay.
Can we define that a bit? So if we were to draw a parallel, in something like a Corda network, and I'm interested in how you're looking at that in Clearmatics as well, there's somebody proposing a transaction. That transaction is confirmed in a process akin to mining without doing the hashing. Who is the validator in that step? How does that look? How is that different in what you're looking at?
Yeah, so we call them... There's a kind of a running joke inside R3. I'm not allowed to name things anymore because everything I name I get wrong. And I came up with so that we call our validators notaries. And I call them notaries because I'm from the UK and we don't have notaries. And I have this pejorative mental model of a notary is this overpriced, overpaid functionary in continental Europe who just stamps documents without looking at them, which is a really sort of bad way of looking at things. And then I discovered people take notaries really seriously in some parts of the world. And now because they think Corda has notaries, they get all scared and they think there's some sort of legal implication. Well, actually, the notary in Corda, it's just like the ordering service in Fabric, for example. It's either a service, so centralized if you want it to be, and weirdly, some people do want it to be centralized, or operated by a collection of mutually distrusting nodes running a BFT algorithm. It is a service that you send a transaction to, and if that transaction doesn't conflict with one that's previously been confirmed, so the confirmation process that a miner also does, then they sign the transaction transaction to say it has now been confirmed, and we call them notaries. Who can be one? If you're running your own network, clearly it's up to you. If you're on Corda network, you can run in your own segregated zone, and it's up to you. If you run on the main Corda network, where the risks are higher because there's more business and more value being transacted, then there's a review process that the independent board goes through to check that you meet the standards.
Question. So, like, for example, is XRP part of the review process?
What was the question, sir?
You were talking earlier about who can be a validator, who can be a node, how are decisions made. And this was like in contrast to the incentive design and how it's similar in terms of being permissionless and public to anyone to agree on. And my question is really, given the fact that you guys very recently launched the XRP setter, was that something that was mutually decided on in the governance, or is that something that is a byproduct of R3's interests within the equity mechanism? And just to be clear, wait, hold on, just to be clear, this isn't a refute or anything. This is just a point about the incentives within the entities that end up building these technologies have, say, at some endpoint and in different segments of this development, and can't just be disregarded. And that's part of the beauty of blockchain.
That's fine, yeah. So I think you're conflating two things. So there's no, the Corda settler is code. It's open source code. You can download it from GitHub, github.com/Corda, and the settler's there. It's deployed at endpoints. Individual nodes who want to run it can run it if they want to settle across any of the payment rails that the settler supports, currently XRP and Swift GPI. You can add other ones, it's open source. It's kind of orthogonal to the network. The network doesn't know how you're choosing to settle. It's a matter for the participants. So there's, right now, we don't run nodes because we're not transacting, we're providing the software. So we're not actually running that. That will be run by participants on the network or on their own network. It's kind of orthogonal.
Yeah, I'd say maybe sort of to tie the governance and validation question together. So in fact, I know Corda does support BFT consensus, but what the DFMI panel were talking about was bringing the benefits of trustlessness to financial transaction layer. And I think having consensus over the global state and not assuming any trust on that does reduce systemic risk in my view. So I would argue that for cash on ledger and particularly regulated environments, that reducing the levels of trust is a good thing for the system. I think Corda has made good moves to introduce the foundation, but there are still certificate signing authorities there. There's still a gate to get through. So there are sort of, I think, fundamental philosophical differences in the way that Clearmatics and maybe the Ethereum community approach things as opposed to Corda, and that's where we differ, I think.
And
actually, I just agree with that. George is too modest to say, but I think you just open sourced your code, and I think that's a great move. So well done.
Thank you.
Can you talk us through some of those philosophical differences? Because I don't know that they're clear to necessarily everybody in the audience.
Well, I guess, I think Corda has done a great job of taking the existing financial system and I'd maybe argue modeling current state. I think we and the DFMI panel are very much interested in modeling future state, and I think Richard spoke quite well about that increases complexity in terms of interoperability. But I think we really want to take that path because we see the benefits are much grander than sort of the iterating what we currently have. And I think we do run the risk of replicating trusted intermediaries, replicating silos, if we don't really strive for that end state.
So we're all being too polite to each other, so I'll let that one pass. But I think SDX think they're building the future too. So.
Well,
I want to give Corda a compliment, actually. They have an amazing team, but and we're being kind of hard on them, but that's because they're shilling all this conference. Head shiller. I think Richard was actually one of the first people who very clearly defined the role of triple book accounting on one single ledger and how that can reduce a lot of the friction points in business processes. And one of the interesting things that I think is happening long-term on Corda is the fact that you have different consortia being built that can later be interconnected into one single business process. The question is whether it becomes a friction point, or are we emulating the exact same business processes, including the data structures that are needed for documentation. And I think that might be an evolutionary stage that we'll see how it gets interconnected to other private DLT projects like Settlement Coin and Hyperledger later on.
So I guess Maya led us on to the next question, which meant we actually planned before this panel. On interoperability, if what you're telling me, George, is from your view of the world, you're looking at kind of a future state, whereas you're maybe accusing other people at looking at digitizing old processes. Can those things talk to each other in an interoperable world, or is that something that said, well, even if the technology supports that, practically it can't work?
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, for sure. So the reason we did Settler was to show that not only to show that Corda can interoperate with anything, but like I said in my talk, to show that here's a repeatable pattern that eliminates all the uncertainty that comes from payments. And the point I was trying to make was, how many times have we made a payment and then you know you've made it, but the recipient, either because they haven't checked or there's a problem in their treasury or whatever it is, they don't think they've received it. So even if you've optimized your business process on a blockchain, Corda or Ontici, whatever it is, you get to the point where you make the payment, and just when you think you're done, you fall out of consensus because there's now this day or two where you're not sure whether the payment's happened. So the thought was, you know what, let's move all the sources of uncertainty to the beginning of the process. How much do I owe you? When do I have to pay you? Which channel am I going to pay you through? Which network? What will you constitute? What will you regard as proof that it happened? And then I go do it, I secure the proof, and then I can demonstrate to you beyond doubt that it has happened. It's just a really simple design pattern that we wrote into code and then we demonstrated on 2 different platforms that anyone else can copy. And I think it will make a big step forward. One of the criticisms I had of and George can put the counter to it in a minute, of the criticisms I had to an interoperability protocol that his firm put forward was, and maybe I misunderstood it, but the very first version of it that I saw presented, it would allow you to interoperate, provided the thing you were interoperating with was the Ethereum virtual machine at both ends. So it kind of felt like, well, okay, but there's a much bigger universe than that, both on Ledger and off Ledger. I think it's moved forward since then, and we're due a time to look at it again. But it's kind of the point I was trying to make, which was, let's not build stuff that is too platform specific, because there's a big world out there of things we have to interoperate with.
Yeah, so I mean, Ion has moved forward, and we now support interoperating with Hyperledger, and we ran a hackathon where actually a participant was interoperating with Corda as well.
Yeah.
And I think we're very interested in modeling not just exchange of value, but exchange of state. And what that introduces is some very interesting possibilities to potentially automate the entire trade life cycle, which is very hard, but possible. But we really believe in doing that in as much as possible, and we have done to date, and in an entirely trustless manner. And that we don't want to, with data flowing between systems, we don't want people sitting in the middle stamping it. We want to be able to transfer that data cryptographically in a secure way that we can receive it, validate it, and apply it.
And it's all well and good transferring between different enterprise blockchains, but does it come back in the real world when it interoperates with Dogecoin or something else important?
Or PTK.
Yeah, well, I think maybe PTK to USC is on the cards.
I would like to see it in Corda Settler.
That will be number 3. That will be the next integration we do.
So if I can talk a bit about privacy, obviously that's something that's quite important for a lot of banks and other large enterprises. Maya, I know that this is something you've done before these guys even heard about blockchain. Can you tell us about
Don't make me blush.
What are some of the theories behind this? And basically, how is this similar or different from things that are happening like Zcash or Monero?
So I think there was a point, I think, that we would be talking to different enterprises, and they had already done POCs, and they played around, and they really liked this whole concept of a distributed ledger, and then you have to break the news and tell them a private blockchain is a transparency machine. And every single one of them, of their competitors, can see exactly what every single other participant of that network can see. And so there was this whole huddle of how do we recreate privacy on that one ledger. And there have been various solutions. Most of them you all know. Trusted enclaves, multi-party computations, and zero-knowledge proofs. And a lot of that effort has been in obfuscating the data, the state, the transactions, the origin, sender, receiver, balance from counterparties. Obviously, that comes at a cost, both in terms of resources of computational side, but also at some point, we're also creating the blockchain and remaking that from a ledger into a verification network of the transactions of the balance. And my personal opinion is how that fits into the business processes that we want to fit into the Internet of Value means that we're going to be transacting proofs of our private data. And essentially, the whole consensus is going to be about setting the rules of what computation is going to run at each data silo, and only verifying the inputs and the output on the blockchain itself.
I guess we take, I guess I'd agree with that, and I guess we take like an additional approach, which is, and it's almost like, it's only when you sort of zoom out you realize, and I guess I think Clearmatics is the same, because George will talk about some of the work they're doing, but I think people maybe don't realize just quite how ambitious some of the work we're actually undertaking right now is. So we're keeping from a Corda perspective, we're keeping a close eye on where the zero knowledge proof research community takes it. If you look at the underlying transaction model of Corda, for the programmers in the room, look at the verify function. It's deliberately written as a pure function, no side effects, returns a Boolean, so that when zero knowledge proof technology is sufficiently general purpose that we can transform pretty much arbitrary code into the appropriate circuit, we're good to go. But we need a strategy for what we do before that happens, because that's a long way off. And we look at we look at the high-profile sort of like emergency fixes that have had to be applied to current deployments of zero-knowledge proofs, and it kind of scares us. So what we're doing in parallel, you can almost regard it as a hedge, but it's a pretty ambitious one, is we're working very closely with trusted enclave technology to be able to run contract verification in Java in a secure enclave. And this comes back to the point I was making earlier, which is it's no good building a system that only 5 rocket scientists can write for. We're only going to have an impact at a global level if average programmers can deploy stuff successfully. So as a stepping stone towards this, because it's a multi-year effort, we've actually just open sourced something that I think will be actually interesting to people outside the blockchain community as much as inside it, which is a Java virtual machine running inside Intel SGX. That developer preview was released last month, and it's fully functional. You can even connect to sort of like a signed enclave that we're running that was signed by the key we have from Intel. So if you're at all interested in that, go look at it. We're making big strides, and Java and SGX is a big deal. So go take a look.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Maya that privacy and blockchains are kind of slightly orthogonal concepts, in that blockchains are designed to be open and transparent, yet people want to transact with privacy. So for me, confidentiality is a somewhat better word, or obfuscation. So hiding or making it difficult to infer data. And we've been very active in this research space. We did a ring signature-based tumbler. We've done a prototype with SGX, where we moved elements of the EVM into SGX. And most recently, we've open sourced Zeth, an implementation of zero cash on Ethereum. But I think, as Richard said, this is still an emergent area, and especially for enterprise, many of the cryptographic techniques used are still very early, and people are concerned about those.
I mean, just as an example, it's taken as a given that the standard crypto schemes you use in a blockchain are various elliptic curves. I can think of several banks for whom anything that isn't RSA is like alien technology.
But there's also some banks that went out of their way to actually implement the first bullet proofs, i.e. ING, and then they open sourced it so the academic community was able to pinpoint the vulnerability in their code. I wanted to make a point that I find that the sci-fi moon math that is being done in private computation is really a dialogue between the public blockchain work and the private blockchain. Because if we're talking of blockchains as distributed computational resources, the amount of computation needed to run any of these proofs, whether or not it's on SGX or ZKPs, fits right into the incentive designs that are being built either by Zcash or just the other day, the first Zeeks protocol that came out, which I think is a fascinating way of thinking about someone else running the computation for these proofs and incentivizing them via cryptocurrencies. And the dialogue, the back and forth between the experimentations going on public blockchain, the academic research, and these guys sitting down with corporates and explaining how private computation can actually get us to the holy grail of not only having digital streamlined workflows, but also disintermediating a lot of those workflows that are unnecessary because we don't need the data reconciliation function that we were so reliant on in legacy systems.
It's true, and just the language you're using kind of makes the point, because I guess all of us, as we speak to corporates, people like me, people like our our field engineers, they have to explain this stuff to serious people inside the IT departments of large institutions, and you think about the incentive structure that acts upon these people. These people's job is to protect the integrity of their firm's IT systems. There is no upside to them from deploying something innovative. A good day for them is the bank doesn't get hacked. It's all downside if they approve something that goes wrong. So we think a lot about how we can make this technology understandable to them and help them understand where the risks are and what they can do to mitigate it. So maybe just one point on privacy. One of the reasons we're taking the approach we are is because we ask ourselves, in the event part of this were proven not to work, so we know that there's been things like Meltdown and Spectre. There have been some some of the approaches Intel's taken to designing its chips are having to be rethought. What if Intel SGX were just catastrophically broken? What would happen? So we've designed our roadmap for it such that if that happened, do we sacrifice integrity or a bit of privacy? And the point is, you never want to sacrifice integrity. So we show how what happens is the system's properties degrade to business as usual quarter privacy, which is actually pretty good as it is. You just lose that extra bit. But being able to show people how if this fails, this is what it degrades to. I guess it's almost a bit like failure of airline systems. You go down from one level of assurance to the next. You have to be able to have these conversations, otherwise you just don't get past the people whose job it is to say no to protect their firm.
But we are at a turning point, and I think this is happening within a macro environment where the concept of having a financial market infrastructure for transacting private data and proving just computation is becoming crucial to our general digital economy. If we're talking about Facebook and different identity leaks, if we're talking about the realization that a lot of the trusted notaries in our personal lives are really data aggregators, if we're talking about credit scores or we're talking about the Facebooks of the world and their hidden tech stack data captures that we have no say or purview as to what is happening. Suddenly there is this convergence again between private personal data and financial market infrastructure, and the need for both to kind of fit in to that same technology.
So we're getting close to the end here, and I know you've been trying to avoid the question, so I'm going to skip right to that one. The next 12 months, what can you guys commit to delivering that's actually going to be useful for the people in this room, and maybe even give something back to the cryptocurrency community for once?
Wow, that was...
Yeah.
give something back. So in quotes, give something back. I mean, I wasn't joking when I said take a look at Java Ring and Intel SGX. So that dev preview is take a look at it. The team who built that are really impressive. It's a really impressive piece of work. In terms of what's coming up over the next 12 months, so the two things I focus on, because I guess they're the two sides of my job, are clients going live or going from live to live at scale, and features coming in the platform. So in terms of clients going live, I talked about Lendicom, the syndicated lending platform, B3I, HQLAX. There's a whole bunch of significant Marco Polo, Voltron. There's a whole bunch. You Google the names and you see these significant projects on Corda going live at scale. And because people are saying, when are we going to see the impact of enterprise blockchain? It's this year. It's real and it's coming. And if I then look at what's coming down the line with Corda, there's a few things. One is, and I think this will be transformational back to the STO conversation people are having, is the forthcoming tokens toolkit. So this is a really, the team spent a lot of time on this, a really well thought out approach to how you model different types of tokens, fungible and non-fungible. Kind of think of it like ERC's 20, 721, those kind of ideas, but turbocharged and brought to the Java world. There's that. There's the furtherance of the SGX work, support for accounts in Corda, so you can actually have multiple users, if you like, in the same node. There's some really interesting features to solve problems that clients have asked for, and I guess that's been the interesting and kind of rewarding thing. A lot of Corda was driven by our initial work with our members and our own design. Now we're getting really high quality requirements from our customers, and then now getting delivered. So it's going to be an exciting year. George?
So I think for us, we're continuing to work extremely hard to deliver USC and doing the hard yards on the regulation, the legal work, and then on the technology layer. So I think we will continue to push for member-owned and governed networks and what that means for the enterprise. I think we see that's the real value of blockchain is perhaps beyond the technology and for what it can introduce beyond what we currently have. I think we're likely to see a couple of other networks running on Ontici, and then moving more into moving out of POC phase, I guess. So there are so many proofs of concepts running on Ethereum, Corda, Hyperledger. I think we're really seeing now enterprise, particularly with the USC project, there's a huge amount of work to allow these enterprises to transact. So for them to integrate their systems, to go through the internal risk analysis, to go through the legal, the compliance. So for me, the core technology stack is there, and it's now about adoption, and we'll be working very hard to enable that.
I actually think that a lot of use cases that we've seen in POCs are going to be canceled in the next year because people are actually going to sit down in front of their budget and see how much integration, implementation, not only the legal and compliance costs are going to necessitate, and then they're going to realize maybe the ROI is just negative on blockchain for that particular thing and that particular thing, and then suddenly, yeah. But we're also going to see, I think, more and more interoperable POCs between chains, first between the private chains, and then one of them might be I don't know who the first, I have no suspicion, who the first private chain that will go as a second layer on top of a public chain will be. But I think we're going to see that.
You show me a public chain that can offer me transaction finality, and I'll do a POC with you the next day.
Okay, so you're not Corda.
Oh. So, and that's a really interesting point. Do you see things like, just kind of bouncing off that, layer 2 technologies inside of a permission blockchain? Does that type of thing happen, like a Lightning Network or Plasma?
I think you are going to see different implementations and maybe even have that interoperability happen via vCosmos or something like that. I think it's interesting that a lot of supposedly layer 2 projects that raised money ended up going to a Hyperledger consortia and then saying, oh, actually we're doing security there. So you're going to see this whole back and forth between projects as they're debating it, as far as their money will allow them to experiment.
They can just raise another ICO.
Sorry?
They can just raise another ICO. That's no problem.
Or they can go to the world's richest quadrillionaire and
I
ask
do
for some
come with
BTK.
benevolence.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, panelists. It's been very insightful. I've learned a ton about this, and we hope to see everything come live, and very excited about it. Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.